It had been months since I'd last felt anything close to excitement. My days blurred into routines, coffee in the same cup, folded clothes in the same pile, dinner at the same time for a man who barely looked up from his phone. Hassan wasn't cruel or careless, he was just occupied. Everything between us had turned efficient, love reduced to schedules, affection hidden behind reminders and receipts. Sometimes I'd watch him get ready in the morning, adjusting his tie in the mirror, and wonder when we stopped looking at each other with interest instead of obligation. That evening started like any other. I had gone out to pick up groceries, thinking the walk might clear my head. It was the kind of dull winter drizzle that seeps into your bones, turning everything gray and quiet. Hassan had texted that he'd be late again, another office dinner, another apology that didn't sound like one. I waited outside the store, the rain getting heavier, the street emptying out. My phone buzzed, a name I recognized but didn't expect, Saad. My husband's colleague that we'd met only twice before, at a company gathering and once when he dropped off some documents. He was polite, always maintaining the kind of respectful distance that made me comfortable. He asked if I needed a ride. He'd seen me from the parking lot, drenched and waiting. I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a car with him alone felt strange, maybe even wrong. But the rain was relentless, and Hassan's call history told me not to expect a rescue. So, I said yes. The car smelled faintly of cologne and rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wipers kept rhythm with the silence, slicing through the dark. I focused on the raindrops racing each other down the glass, pretending not to notice his occasional glances. Then, gently, he asked, "Do you still paint?" It took me a second to register. That one question, so simple, yet somehow so personal. I hadn't mentioned painting in months, maybe years. Hassan had once told him, I assumed. I nodded, smiling faintly. Not really. Haven't had time. He laughed softly, not mocking, just knowing. You should. It suits you. Those words shouldn't have meant anything. But they did. They broke through the fog I'd been walking in for so long. Someone remembered something about me that wasn't connected to being a wife or a caretaker. I found myself talking about colors, unfinished canvases, how I'd stopped because everything around me felt gray. He listened. Not the polite kind of listening people do to pass time, but the kind that makes you feel noticed. Halfway home, the rain grew heavier, blurring everything outside. The world felt suspended, as if the car were moving through another dimension where conversation mattered more than the rules waiting beyond the door. He told me about his transfer from another city, about missing his mother's cooking, about how the city felt cold despite its crowds. I laughed more than I had in weeks. When we finally reached my street, I felt an unexpected pang, disappointment that the ride was ending. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, pretending to check my phone. He turned off the engine but didn't move. For a second, we both sat there, surrounded by the sound of rain hitting metal. His eyes met mine, not with intention, but with something softer, something questioning that I looked away first. "Thank you for the ride," I said, my voice lower than I intended. That he smiled, almost apologetically. "Anytime." That word lingered as I stepped out, pulling my shawl tighter against the cold. I walked toward the house, the glow from the porch light spilling onto the wet pavement. I didn't turn back, but I felt his gaze following me, respectful yet heavy inside. The house smelled of leftover food and quiet. I dropped the grocery bags on the counter and stared at the clock. Hassan wouldn't be home for hours. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. There was color in my cheeks, a faint brightness in my eyes that had nothing to do with happiness, but with awakening that I told myself it was harmless. Just a ride. Just a conversation. Nothing more. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence began to stretch. Every small detail of that drive replayed in my mind, the sound of his voice, the way he said my name, the flicker of his smile when I spoke. It was ridiculous, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That I wondered why something so simple had shaken me. Maybe because it reminded me of a version of myself I'd forgotten. The one who used to feel, to laugh, to be curious. Hassan's absence had left a space inside me, and for the first time, someone had accidentally stepped into it. When Hassan came home later that night, I pretended to sleep. I could hear him change quietly, his familiar scent drifting across the room. He leaned over to kiss my forehead, and I almost turned to face him, but didn't. I wasn't angry, just disconnected. The sound of rain still echoed in my ears, and for reasons I didn't want to name, that short drive had followed me home. That I kept telling myself it was nothing. That's how it always begins, with a harmless favor, a moment of kindness. But sometimes, all it takes for a life to shift is a few unspoken words between two people sitting in the rain. The next morning began with the same careful rhythm, yet something in me was shifting. I moved through the house with practiced ease, but my thoughts kept circling back to the quiet space between Arman and me. I wanted to believe the silence would mend itself, that we only needed rest, but the emptiness pressed heavier each day. At work, Zoya handed me a coffee with a knowing smile. She asked if I had been sleeping, and I shrugged, offering a safe half-truth. During lunch she mentioned her brother Omar, who had just started helping with a project in our department. Later, when I met him briefly, he greeted me with warmth that felt effortless. His questions were simple, about my work, my ideas, and yet I felt oddly visible, as though someone had turned on a light I hadn't realized was dim. Over the following week, our paths crossed often. Sometimes Omar sent short messages about tasks, but they grew into little exchanges about books and music. I told myself they were harmless, only words filling an otherwise dull afternoon. Still, I caught myself checking my phone with an eagerness I couldn't explain. Each notification steadied something inside me, a reminder that I could still spark curiosity in another person. Evenings at home became quieter. Arman, tired from meetings, collapsed into the couch while I hovered near, unsure how to breach the calm that felt too brittle to disturb. I wanted to tell him about the small things that had brightened my day, but his focus stayed on the screen or drifting thoughts. I reminded myself that marriage required patience, yet a restless pulse in me kept whispering that I was fading behind his gaze. One night, after Sami fell asleep, I lingered over an unanswered message from Omar. He had asked about a poem I once mentioned, wanting to know why it mattered to me. The question was ordinary, but it carried a gentleness that made me pause. I typed a reply, then erased it, then wrote again, choosing words carefully, aware that a line was close though I couldn't quite name it. The next day, I caught my reflection in a shop window, phone in hand, smiling at a text. For a moment I didn't recognize the expression, lighter, almost shy. The realization unsettled me. I wasn't searching for romance, yet attention had become its own quiet pull, something I didn't want to admit even to myself. That evening, I sat beside Arman at dinner, listening to him describe a colleague's promotion. I nodded at the right places, but my thoughts wandered. I wanted him to ask about me, to notice the small shadows beneath my eyes or the way I hesitated before speaking. He didn't. I felt an ache that wasn't anger, more like an old bruise touched again. Later, in the solitude of our bedroom, I scrolled through Omar's latest message. He had sent a photo of a sunrise from his commute, writing that it reminded him of a conversation we'd had about beginnings. It was innocent, yet the intimacy of sharing something meant only for me stirred conflicting emotions. I set the phone aside, heart unsettled, unsure whether to answer or retreat. Sleep came slowly. I lay there measuring the weight of loyalty, wondering how fragile a marriage could become without a single argument or betrayal. Perhaps it wasn't one grand choice but a series of tiny hesitations, glances, and omissions that shaped distance. I thought of Sammy's laughter, of the home we had built, of the man sleeping a few inches away. I knew I didn't want to lose any of it. Still, I couldn't deny the part of me that craved to feel alive again, to be heard without asking. The next morning, Omar greeted me with casual warmth, and I felt my pulse quicken despite myself. I told him about a book Sammy loved, steering the conversation toward safe ground, yet the undercurrent remained. On the way home, I resolved to draw a clear boundary, to protect what truly mattered. But resolve faltered when I imagined another evening wrapped in the same unspoken distance. That night, as Arman prepared for bed, I studied his face, searching for an opening. I wanted to tell him that I missed us, that I needed more than quiet companionship. The words stayed locked inside, waiting for a courage I hadn't yet found. I switched off the lamp and lay still, listening to his steady breathing while my own thoughts churned. A part of me longed to reach across the gap and anchor myself to him again. Another part hovered at the edge of temptation, unsure how to step back without leaving pieces of myself behind. Days passed, but the silence between us grew heavier. Imran no longer teased me about his strange question, but it lived between every word we didn't say. He was there, present, polite, predictable, but emotionally miles away. Sometimes I caught him watching me as if searching for something, and when our eyes met, he'd just look away. I told myself it was work stress, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had shifted since that night. His wish had planted a thought neither of us could unthink. Then came the afternoon I met Ryan again. It wasn't planned. He showed up at the same cafe I went to after work, and when he spotted me, his smile felt like sunlight breaking through a cloud I didn't know I'd been living under. We talked again, small things at first, harmless things. He asked about my writing, about Imran, about life. He had a calm way of listening, of making silence feel safe. When I left, I told myself it was nothing. Just conversation. But the warmth stayed with me all evening. Imran noticed. He noticed everything. He looked at me differently that night, his tone sharp but quiet. "You've been smiling a lot lately," he said, not as a compliment, more as an observation. I asked what he meant, but he just shrugged. "I'm glad you're happy." The words sounded kind, but they carried something cold. It wasn't approval, it was detachment. Like he'd already stepped outside of the marriage and was watching me from a distance. The next few weeks blurred into a rhythm of confusion. Imran became unpredictable, sometimes attentive, sometimes distant, sometimes almost cruel in how calm he seemed. I couldn't read him anymore. I tried to bring up that night, to ask what he really meant when he said those things, but he always brushed it off. "It was just a thought experiment," he'd say. "You think too much." But the damage was already done. I started thinking all the time about what honesty really meant, about what he was trying to prove. Ryan kept appearing in small ways, texting about something he saw that reminded him of our talk, inviting me to a charity event, asking if I'd had lunch. I tried to resist, but each exchange felt like a small rescue from the emptiness at home. His words filled spaces Imran had left hollow. I told myself it was friendship, that I needed someone to talk to, that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But every time I heard my phone buzz, my heart beat faster than it should have. One night, I told Imran I'd run into Ryan again. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me for a long time, then said quietly, "If you ever do something, just don't lie to me about it." I froze. There was no accusation in his voice, just quiet certainty. Like he was setting a rule for a game I hadn't agreed to play. I asked him what that meant, but he didn't answer. He kissed my forehead, wished me good night, and turned away. After that, I couldn't sleep. His words kept echoing, twisting, turning. Was he giving me permission, or daring me to betray him? Was he so sure I wouldn't, or did he secretly want me to? I wanted to believe it was a test, but part of me feared it wasn't. Part of me feared he meant every word. The following week, Ryan and I met again. It happened naturally. He offered to drop me home after a meeting that ran late. The car ride was quiet, filled with unsaid things. When he parked outside my building, he looked at me with concern. "You look like you're carrying too much," he said softly. I didn't respond. He didn't push. But when I turned to leave, he touched my hand, brief, uncertain, gentle. It should have meant nothing, but it felt like everything I'd been starved of. I pulled away, whispered a goodbye, and walked inside trembling. That night, I stared at Imran while he slept. His breathing was calm, steady, peaceful. For a moment, I hated him for how easily he slept, for how effortlessly he'd placed this storm inside me and then walked away from it. I wanted to shake him, to ask him if this was what he wanted, to turn me into someone who questioned her own reflection. Instead, I whispered the question he once asked me: "If you ever wanted someone else, would you tell me?" He didn't answer. Of course, days turned into a blur of messages, glances, guilt. Ryan never crossed a line, not until the night the rain wouldn't stop. I'd stayed late at work, the roads were flooding, and he offered to drop me home again. The drive was quiet. The world outside was blurred with rain, and everything felt suspended in that moment. When the car stopped, I didn't move. He looked at me, and I looked back. There was no plan, no logic, just exhaustion, warmth, and the ache of being seen. What happened next wasn't loud or wild. It was quiet, almost sad. A moment that felt both wrong and inevitable. When it was over, the guilt didn't come instantly. It arrived later, slowly, like fog. I sat there afterward, unable to speak. Ryan said my name once, softly, as if afraid to break the air. I didn't answer. I just left. When I got home, Imran's car was in the driveway. He was inside, pretending to sleep on the couch. I knew he'd been waiting. I didn't know if he suspected anything, but I couldn't meet his eyes. I went straight to bed, lay there in the dark, and whispered into the silence, "I did what you wished." The words hurt more than the act itself. By morning, everything looked normal again. Breakfast, routine, work, nothing had changed, except everything had. I carried on, mechanical and numb, waiting for something: guilt, confession, forgiveness, but none came. Imran didn't ask, and I didn't tell. Maybe that was his wish all along, to see how far I would go, and how quietly I could live with it. Morning came quietly, as if the world itself was careful not to disturb what had broken overnight. The house looked the same, but the air inside carried the heaviness of unspoken guilt. Maya moved through the kitchen mechanically, her hands doing what her mind refused to. The sound of Rayhan's door remained closed, and she didn't dare knock. Between them now existed a silence sharper than any words could ever be. She wanted to believe time would dull it, that pretending would fix what truth had shattered, but even silence had a pulse, and she could feel it every time she breathed. When Rayhan finally came out, his face was pale, his eyes swollen from a sleepless night. He greeted her softly, avoiding eye contact, and she answered with the same hollow politeness. They spoke of ordinary things, breakfast, the weather, his classes, but each word felt artificial, rehearsed. There was no anger, no confrontation, only the heavy politeness of two people pretending they had not crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The simple rhythm of daily life became their disguise. Days slipped by. Faisal called once from another city, asking if everything was fine. Maya said yes. Her voice sounded calm even though her heart wasn't. Rayhan stood nearby, listening, guilt flickering across his face. When the call ended, she turned to him briefly, wanting to say something, anything, but words wouldn't come. They both went back to their separate silences, each drowning in their own version of regret. At night, Maya lay awake, replaying his words over and over. If he doesn't love you, let me be the one who does. They echoed inside her mind until she wanted to scream. It wasn't the sentence itself that haunted her, but what it revealed, how much her own sadness had shaped it. She had spent years starving for affection, and in her loneliness, she had allowed boundaries to blur. Rayhan's request was wrong, but it was born from the very emptiness she had carried. That realization made her shame even deeper. Rayhan, meanwhile, became distant. He stopped sitting with her, avoided her eyes, and left early for university. He moved like someone trying to punish himself quietly. His laughter disappeared, replaced by long silences and guilt he couldn't hide. One night, Maya found a piece of paper on the dining table, a letter written in his neat handwriting. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple confession of remorse. He wrote that he didn't know what came over him, that he hated himself for saying what he said, and that he wished she could forget it ever happened. At the end, he had written, "I only wanted you to be happy." I forgot what that meant. She folded the letter carefully and kept it in a drawer she never opened again. When Faisal finally returned home after weeks, the irony was cruel. He brought gifts, spoke with fake warmth, and acted like everything was fine. He didn't notice the strained quiet between his wife and son. He was too used to silence to see that this one was different. During dinner, he joked about how Rayhan had become the man of the house. Maya forced a smile. Rayhan excused himself early. Faisal didn't notice the tremor in her hand when she picked up her glass. That night, Maya stood by Rayhan's door for a long time before knocking. When he opened it, she saw in his eyes a boy crushed under the weight of something he couldn't undo. She didn't lecture or scold. Her voice was soft, tired, but steady. She told him that they would never speak of that night again, not because she wanted to forget it, but because remembering it would destroy them both. "We'll move forward," she said quietly, "and you'll promise me to live your life, not carry my pain." He nodded, tears gathering but unfallen. For a moment, they stood in silence that felt almost forgiving. He said, "I'm sorry, Mama." She replied, "I know," and placed her hand lightly on his head before walking away. That simple gesture, pure, motherly,
final, closed the distance between guilt and forgiveness without a single word more. It didn't erase what had happened, but it anchored it in a place where it could no longer grow. In the days that followed, life settled into a fragile rhythm again. Rayhan focused on his studies, Maya on her work. Faisal continued to drift in and out, oblivious to the emotional ruins he had left behind. But something inside both Maya and Rayhan had changed permanently. Their bond remained, but it was different now, restrained, quiet, shaped by an unspoken promise never to repeat the past. Sometimes, when the house grew quiet at night, Maya would hear the faint echo of rain and feel the weight of that memory pressing at the edges of her mind. It didn't hurt anymore, it simply reminded her how thin the line was between love and loneliness. She no longer blamed him entirely. She blamed time, distance, and silence. The perfect storm that had swallowed judgment. Years would pass, and no one outside those walls would ever know the truth. Rayhan would grow older, leave for work in another city, build his own life. Maya would remain where she was, living a version of peace that came with acceptance rather than forgetting. Sometimes his calls would come late at night, short and polite, and she would hear in his voice that same quiet care, this time with the right distance between them. And though the past remained unspoken, it lingered in the air of that house like the faint scent of rain after a storm, proof that something had happened once, something that changed them both forever. The narrator's voice would fade over that silence. Sometimes betrayal has no villain, and forgiveness has no hero. It is just two hearts learning to live with what they cannot erase. Some truths are not confessed because they are too dark, but because speaking them would only keep them alive. And so they carried it quietly, she as a mother who forgave, and he as a son who would never forgive himself. The house stood still, ordinary to the world, yet inside its walls lived a story no one would ever tell again, a story of love misunderstood, of silence mistaken for safety, of a truth that would sleep forever between them, untouched, but never truly gone.